Are we running low on certain species of fish in our oceans, lakes, and rivers? Are some fish in danger of becoming extinct? Now, joining us today to talk about this hot button topic is Ray Hilborn. He's an expert in marine biology and a prominent professor at the University of Washington. Ray joins us now from Seattle, Washington. Ray, welcome to Bridge City News.
Morning. Very happy to be here.
So, Ray, can you provide an overview of the current state of fish population around the world and in Canadian waters? Are there some serious issues? Are certain species severely at risk?
Well, okay, and the big picture is, in general, fish are doing fine. Some, on average, they're going up, both in the Western world where we have good data. We have the data are very different in different parts of the world. We know much less about the large fisheries of South and Southeast Asia than we do of those of Europe, North America, South America. So for the places we do have good data, and that would include Canada, fish populations are on average increasing. Now, there's always some that are going down, and the big cod stock in eastern Canada that collapsed it was closed in 1990s. It really hasn't recovered. But Western Canadian salmon populations have generally remained in decline. So it really depends on where and exactly what populations you're talking about.
Is that due to overfishing maybe having a significant impact right now on the fish populations?
No, in general, in Canada and the United States, Europe outside of the Mediterranean, overfishing is not really a serious problem. Fish stocks go up and down. Climate change is having an enormous impact on various stocks, particularly salmon. It really all depends.
So how would climate change be impacting the salmon?
Well, in general, things are getting warmer. So the southern stocks in Canada, the Fraser River, have been doing much worse as it's gotten warmer, whereas the northern stocks, and I spend my summers up in Bristol Bay, Alaska, we've just had a run of 8 years that are the highest in recorded history, and we can tell from other historical data, the highest in the last 1,000 years. So they've been benefiting by warming. In the south, we've generally not benefited by warming. And the Fraser River has gotten so hot at times that diseases break out. So that's been the big, most immediate impact. A lot of marine fish are just moving. They're moving farther north in the northern hemisphere as the climate changes.
Now, you said the data's been collected for 1,000 years. Wow, I didn't realize it goes back that far. Ray, how much is pollution really contributing to killing a lot of our marine life? Pollution like maybe oil spills or single-use plastics, which our government here in Canada has been banning.
I would say for marine fish, there's very little evidence that either of those are a factor, except locally. So Exxon Valdez oil spill. Actually, it wasn't a big disaster for fish. It was for some of the local marine mammals. The Deepwater Horizon had a large impact in its area. But globally, the bigger pollution impact is actually in coastal fisheries near urban areas where runoff from terrestrial sources and sediment are much bigger factors on the fish populations there than most. Those are often the dominant factors in impacting coastal marine ecosystems.
Now, many environmental NGOs are actively advocating for the establishment of no-take marine protected areas, or MPAs. How do you perceive the impact of NGO pressure on Canadian politicians in really shaping fishing regulations and policies?
Well, it's enormous. That the NGOs have been extremely effective at going right to the leadership, right to the Prime Minister, not only in Canada, but also President Bush, President Obama, President Biden have all basically they've been convinced that they can be environmental heroes by declaring parts of the ocean no take areas. The same's been true in Australia and New Zealand. And it hasn't come from a ground up scientific analysis. It's come from very wealthy foundations with lots of political power, people like Leonardo DiCaprio, basically funding people to go and convince the leaders of countries that we need these no-take areas.
Leonardo DiCaprio. He was shooting a movie here in southern Alberta. I think it was called
Is
The
that
Revenant.
right?
And it was really warm during the wintertime. He says, see, people even here in Alberta have never seen such warmness. It's climate change. No, actually, it was called a Chinook over the Canadian Rockies, and it's very common here. And it kind of opened his eyes while I was here. So, but that's a story for another time. Ray, the 30 by 30 initiative aims to conserve 30% of Canada's oceans by the year 2030. How do you see this initiative really affecting the fishing industry?
Well, it depends on how it's implemented. And I think that's too modest a goal. I think we should protect 100% of Canada's marine waters, but protect it with the most effective regulations that are needed. And it's very rarely going to be no-take marine protected areas. You know, if the problem is overfishing, then you reduce fishing, and there's ways to do that, and we do it, and Canada's done it quite successfully. I mean, there's a quite an influential paper that came out a couple of years ago looking at the threats to marine ecosystems. And number one was climate change, warming, ocean acidification, potential for sea level rise, big storms. Number two was coastal runoff and coastal impacts. And even shipping had a higher impact, according to that analysis, than fishing. And yet, the 30 by 30 from the NGO perspective is 30% no-take areas, and fundamentally, all it's really going to do is keep people from fishing there.
Let's circle back to the 30 by 30 for just a moment here, Ray. Can you talk about the potential benefits and drawbacks of establishing no-take MPAs as part of the 30 by 30 initiative here in Canada?
Well, if you establish no-take MPAs, it's very clear that if there was fishing there before, that the abundance of fish in that area increases unless they happen to be really highly migratory fish. So that's what's happened, say, with high seas tuna MPAs. It doesn't make any difference. They just move in and out all the time. But in coastal Canada, a lot of the species that don't move too much will go up in abundance. But what happens is the fishing boats are then forced to fish somewhere else, and they fish harder there. So you make things higher abundance inside the closed area, and you have lower abundance outside the closed area.
Is fishing kind of a dying industry, or do you see it thriving right now in the 21st century?
It depends upon where. I mean, initiatives like the 30 by 30 no-take areas are killing the fishing industry. And the United States, if you look at how much of the potential food production from marine fisheries countries are achieving, Canada's one of the lowest, and the United States is one of the lowest. And that's because we are so wrapped up in being very precautionary in how we manage that our food production is going down, not because it can't be taken, but because we're restricting how it is taken. Whereas countries like Iceland and Norway are really using their full potential resources.
So how do you view the role of scientific research and data then in shaping fishing regulations and ensuring sustainable fishery management here in Canada?
Well, if first we have to decide what is our objective. Are we trying to produce food? Are we trying to have an ocean that is untouched by humans? But once you know what your objective is, and that's not a scientific question, that's a political question. Once you decide what your objective is, then science is the place where it can guide you to achieving whatever your objective is. So I'd say science is central, but you do have to have firm policy objectives.
So Ray, what are some of the successful examples of sustainable fisheries management practices here in Canada, or even internationally, that could serve as maybe models for improvement?
Well, the major fisheries of the U.S. West Coast, except for salmon, have been doing very well. So halibut, black cod, rockfish, all those groundfish fisheries, the prawn fisheries, the shrimp fisheries, those have all been managed on a scientific basis, and they're all potentially thriving. But they are all threatened by closing areas to fishing.
How do you believe Indigenous groups are involved in or maybe influenced by policies related to marine conservation and fisheries management, Ray?
Well, that's interesting. So I was frankly surprised to see that the First Nations were basically supporting the proposals for major closures in northern British Columbia, because there's a fair number of First Nations are involved in the commercial fisheries, but I've been told that they're supporting this initiative because they think it is part of the transition to their controlling the fisheries rather than the existing stakeholders in the fishery. I can't document that. I've simply been told that by people who are involved in the process.
Are there collaborative efforts maybe between government agencies, NGOs, and various Indigenous communities in North America to really address conservation and sustainable fishing practices?
Well, in Washington State, the salmon are co-managed by our Indigenous Native Indian tribes and by the state of Washington. So they all have scientists. The tribes are one of the major employers of our students. They all have scientists, and they work out how to manage those populations. And that resulted from a legal decision back in the 1980s, called the Bolt decision, that gave Native Americans the right to catch half of the catch of salmon, and now that's been extended to invertebrates and shellfish as well. And they've worked out very well-functioning collaborative management systems.
You know, Ray, I wanted to ask you something. When I was a kid, my parents used to say, Hal, stay away from too much tuna. Mercury levels are too high. It's not healthy for you. Is that an old wives' tale, or are there certain fish that maybe we should not overconsume?
Certainly, there are certain fish you shouldn't overconsume. Tuna doesn't happen to be one of them. I mean, the top predators tend to accumulate mercury, that's true, but they also accumulate selenium. And it turns out that if you have selenium and mercury at the same time, the selenium inactivates the mercury. Oh. The place you want to avoid eating too much fish is, I believe, still the Great Lakes, where the legacy of all the industrial pollution in the Great Lakes there have been government restrictions both in the U.S. and Canada for decades saying, you shouldn't eat, and it depends on the species. But for marine fish, I don't think it's a concern at all.
Now, Ray, looking ahead, what are some of the more crucial steps or strategies to really ensure both the conservation of Canada's marine ecosystems and the sustainability of the fishing industry overall?
Well, I mean, we need a solid science program, and we need the decisions to be science-based. And Canada's a little bit different in that in the U.S., the way the legislation and the system works is the scientific advice must be followed. Although fishing can be more conservative than the scientific advice, but it cannot be less conservative. In Canada, the Minister of Fisheries has absolute control over decisions, and I just haven't been following the Canadian political landscape well enough to really understand the extent to which the science is being followed or isn't being followed. But that's essential. But you also just need very clear policies, and that's one of the problems we're running into. Is what are we trying to achieve? And both in the U.S., Canada, almost everywhere I know, what's our objective? And those are typically so vague that you can't ask scientists what's the best policy to achieve our objective, because the objective isn't written down. So as soon as you tell me how much we want to maximize food production, et cetera, then the science can answer that question, how to do that. But where that isn't well defined, then the science can't directly give you the answer.
Ray Hilborn is an expert in marine biology and a prominent professor at the University of Washington. Ray, thanks so much for joining us today from Seattle.
Hey, well, thank you. It's been a pleasure.